The most famous haunted house in America was never haunted. And we know that, because one of the men who helped build the legend eventually sat down and explained exactly how it was done, over a table, with a lawyer, and, in his words, many bottles of wine. December 1975. A family called the Lutzes move into a big Dutch colonial on a canal in Amityville, Long Island. They have bought it at a price that is far too good, for a reason everybody in town already knows. 28 days later, they run. They leave in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, and they do not come back for their furniture. What they described afterward became the story of a generation. Cold spots that no heating could touch. Green slime seeping through the walls. Swarms of flies at the windows in the dead of winter. A crucifix that turned upside down. Hoof prints in the snow. And glowing red eyes, watching from the darkness outside a child's bedroom. It sold. It sold a book that became a global bestseller. It sold a film, and a franchise, and 50 years of sequels. It sold this quiet street to busloads of tourists who still come, and still take photographs of the windows. And almost none of it survived contact with a weather report. Because before the ghosts, this house had a real story. A far worse one. 6 people died inside it, and the legend that replaced them has done something strange and quietly cruel. It has made a family of 6 almost impossible to remember. So this is what actually happened at 112 Ocean Avenue. And how the ghosts got invented on top of them. The DeFeos had arrived in Amityville in 1965 with money, ambition, and a boat. Ronald DeFeo Sr. managed his father-in-law's car dealership in Brooklyn, a big, forceful man with a temper that everybody in his household organized their lives around. His wife Louise ran the home. They had 5 children. The house they bought backed straight onto a canal, with a boathouse, a swimming pool, and a sign posted out front that read, of all things, high hopes. From the water it looked like the reward at the end of a life done right. Church on Sundays. New cars in the driveway. Big Italian-American dinners with too much food. And it held together, from the outside, right up until the night it didn't. Which is the part of this story that nobody who tells the ghost version ever bothers with, that this was, first and last, a house where a family was quietly coming apart while the neighbors saw nothing at all. The eldest son was the problem money could not fix. Ronald Jr., everyone called him Butch, was 23, unemployed in every meaningful sense, and increasingly at war with the world. He was heavily into drugs. He was given cash, cars, and second chances, and he burned through all of them. His father tried to control him with the only tools he had, money, discipline, and his fists. The two of them fought constantly, loud, ugly, public fights that carried out of the windows and into the street. Neighbors heard it. Nobody did anything, because in the 1970s, on a street like that, what happened inside a man's house was his own business. And there is a warning here that everyone missed. During one of those arguments, Butch reportedly pointed a loaded weapon at his own father, in front of the family. And nothing happened. No police. No hospital. No intervention. Life simply resumed, because admitting how bad it had become was not an option in a household built on appearances. So the danger stayed indoors, behind the front door, growing quietly worse, in a big comfortable house with a boat and a pool and a sign that said high hopes. The night of November the 13th, 1974. Out of respect for the victims, this video will not describe what happened in that house. But in the early hours of that morning, Ronald DeFeo Jr. moved through the rooms of his own home carrying a high-powered rifle. 6 people. His mother. His father. His 2 younger brothers. His 2 younger sisters. The youngest was 9 years old. An entire family, ended in a matter of minutes, inside a sleeping house on a quiet street. And here is the detail that has bothered investigators for 50 years, the one that would, later, feed every ghost story ever told about this address. A high-powered rifle fired indoors is not loud. It is catastrophic. Fired 8 times, in a wooden house, it should have woken the entire street. It didn't. Not one neighbor reported hearing anything. And inside the house, every single victim was found face down in their bed, in a position of sleep, as though not one of them had ever stirred, or run, or fought, or even opened their eyes. Investigators wondered about sedation. No conclusive evidence was ever found. To this day, exactly how one young man killed 6 sleeping people, one after another, without a single one waking, has never been fully explained. Keep that hole in mind. Because in a few years' time, somebody is going to fill it, with something supernatural, and something extremely profitable. There is one more piece of that night that has never been settled, and it is worth saying plainly because DeFeo himself spent decades stirring it. Over the years he claimed, at various times, that he had not acted alone, that his sister Dawn had been involved, that an accomplice had been in the house, that he had been protecting someone. He told a different version to almost everyone who asked. Investigators found nothing to support any of it, and most people who worked the case regarded as exactly what it looks like, a man in a cell, discovering that the truth was the only thing he had left to sell. What Butch DeFeo did next was, in its own way, as chilling as anything that came before. He showered. He got dressed. He went out and moved through an ordinary day, errands, a bar, conversations, with his family lying behind him in that house. Then, that evening, he burst into a local bar shouting that somebody had shot his mother and father. He was panicked. He was desperate. He was the picture of a young man who had just walked into a nightmare, and a group of people went back to the house with him to see. They found all 6. The police were called. And almost immediately, quiet suspicion began to circle the one member of the DeFeo family who was still alive. Butch's first story was a mob hitman, a professional, sent to destroy his family over some old grievance. For a few hours, detectives actually chased it. And then it fell apart in his hands. The details kept moving. The timeline would not hold. And everything in that house pointed at one person. Confronted, he confessed. His explanation was as flat as it was terrible. Once it started, he said, he just couldn't stop. There had been no hitman. There had only ever been him. At trial, his defense argued insanity, that he had heard voices in the house, telling him what to do. The prosecution's psychiatrist argued the opposite, that he had known exactly what he was doing, and had been coherent enough to lie about it for a day. The jury agreed with the prosecution. In November 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, and he would spend it changing his story, again, and again, and again, for 46 years, until he died in custody in 2021. But the voices in the house, the ones his lawyer had put in front of a jury, did not go to prison with him. They stayed at 112 Ocean Avenue, waiting for somebody to move in. 13 months later, George and Kathy Lutz bought the house, furniture included, at a price so low it should have been a warning. They knew exactly what had happened there. They said they weren't superstitious people. They moved in with 3 children and a dog. 28 days later, they were gone. And what happened in between, as they told it, became one of the most successful horror stories in publishing history. The cold, the flies, the slime, the crucifix, the red eyes at the window, a priest driven from the house by a voice telling him to get out. And the timing deserves a closer look than it usually gets. The Lutzes were in financial trouble. They had bought a house they could not really afford, in a market that was punishing them, and they were behind. When they walked out of it after 28 days, they did not walk to a police station. Within weeks, they were talking to a lawyer, and to a writer, about a book. A writer named J. Anson turned their account into a book. The Amityville Horror sold in the millions. Then came the film, in 1979, and the sequels, and the remakes, and a franchise that has never really stopped. A dead family had been converted into an industry. And then people started checking. Weather records showed no snow on the days the Lutzes described those hoofprints. The police had no record of the calls they claimed to have made. The priest's account changed with the telling. Neighbors reported no disturbances at all. Item by item, the haunting failed every test anybody put it to. Even the physical claims fell over. The famous red eyes belonged, according to the family themselves, to a pig-like creature called Jody that appeared to their 5-year-old daughter. The hoofprints in the snow were reported on a day the records show no snow fell. The green slime was never photographed by anyone. And the priest at the center of the story, the one supposedly driven out by a voice, told several versions over the years, and his own church has never supported the account. But the real answer had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. William Weber was Ronald DeFeo's defense attorney, the man who had built the insanity defense, the man who had put voices in that house in front of a jury. And after the book made everybody rich except him, Weber went public. He said, on the record, that he and the Lutzes had created the horror story together. That they had sat down and shaped it. And, in the line that has followed this case ever since, that they did it over many bottles of wine. The Lutzes denied it, and sued, and the court spent years untangling who had lied to whom. But the judge in one of those suits said something that ought to be the last word on Amityville. He said the evidence showed the story was, quote, largely a work of fiction, relying in large part upon the suggestions of Mr. Weber. So the flies, the slime, the red eyes, they were, in the most literal sense, a defense strategy that outgrew its courtroom. A story built to explain how a young man could kill 6 sleeping people without waking any of them. And when the jury refused to buy it, somebody sold it to the public instead. And yet the story will not die, and that is the most interesting thing about it. Because a haunted house is, in a strange way, a comfort. It says the evil came from somewhere else, that it seeped up through the floorboards, that it was aimed at the family, that no ordinary person could have done this. The truth on Ocean Avenue offers no such comfort. It says the evil grew up in that house, at that dinner table, in that argument nobody called the police about. The house is still there. Its owners have changed the address, so that tourists can no longer find it by number, and replaced the famous quarter-moon windows that a movie poster taught the world to read as eyes. Every family who has lived there since has said the same, boring, unprofitable thing, nothing happens. No cold spots. No flies. No voices. One later owner said the only thing that ever disturbed his sleep was the tourists, the cars that slow down outside at night, and the strangers who stand on the pavement taking photographs of his children's bedroom windows. It is just a house. It has always been just a house. And the 6 people are still, mostly, a footnote. Ronald DeFeo Sr., 43. Louise, 42. Dawn, who was 18 and had just finished school. Allison, 13. Mark, 12, who played on the local football team. And John Matthew, who was 9 years old. They were buried together, and the funeral was crowded, because in 1974, before any of this became a brand, they were simply a family from Ocean Avenue that the town had known for a decade. There is no memorial to them at the house. There is no plaque. The tour buses do not stop for them. Ask 100 people today what happened at Amityville, and 99 will tell you about a ghost. Almost none of them will be able to name a single person who actually died there. That, more than any red-eyed demon, is the real haunting of 112 Ocean Avenue, 6 people who were replaced, in the world's memory, by a story that was better for business. So here is the question I'll leave you with. The haunting was invented to explain a hole in the truth, how 6 people could die in their beds without waking. That hole is still there. 50 years later, nobody has ever satisfactorily explained it. So which is the more unsettling thought, that the ghost story was a lie, or that we needed one, because the truth of what a son did in that house was harder to look at than a demon? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe, because the next case is already waiting. Some fences are white. And some houses get a legend, so nobody has to remember the people.